Awesome tips for super wide angle photography coming up.
This video is sponsored by Urban Street Narratives. More on that later. Hi guys, my name is Matti Sulanto. I'm a photographer. In this video, I'm going to be sharing 4 awesome tips for super wide angle photography. And I have a feeling that at least one of these tips can be very useful and inspirational for your super wide angle photography.
Let's start off with some traditional panning motion blur. A super wide angle is really cool for panning type of motion blur pictures because the built-in perspective distortion enhances the motion towards the corners and edges of the frame. So the end result is going to look very different to a panned motion blur pictures with a standout lens or a telephoto lens, which is very prominent in this one. The color palette also looks really pleasing in this one. Blue, yellow, a little bit of green. It's a nice looking picture in my opinion.
The lens I'm using today is the brand new Tamron 16-30mm f2.8 wide angle zoom lens. I have the Sony E-mount version, but this lens is also available for the Nikon Z mount. And here's the compulsory disclaimer. This lens is not mine. This is on loan from Focus Nordic Finland, who represent Tamron lenses here in Finland. Big thanks Focus Nordic for letting me take this lens out for a spin.
Let's try some more panning motion blur pictures here inside a metro station. Those moving trains always look so cool. In this one also the wide angle look is very clear. And even though the whole frame is a little bit blurry, I still like that I can see the people inside the train. It adds like another layer to the picture. Here's another similar picture, which is also really cool. I like this layered effect, like unsharp, sharp. And this is something you may want to try for yourself too.
Today is a really bright day, and to make sure I can get some motion blur pictures also in this bright light, I brought my variable 1 to 5 stop ND filter that I'm gonna mount on my lens when I'm trying to capture some motion blur pictures today in this bright sunlight. Because for motion blur, you are going to need a relatively long shutter speed.
You can also create really awesome looking motion blur pictures from a moving vehicle, like in this case from a moving tram. I'm standing at the rear of the tram and I'm trying really hard to keep the tram in the foreground as still as possible, but my long shutter speed is going to make everything outside of the tram blurry and look like the tram is going at warp speed. That effect is very prominent in these 2 pictures. You can clearly see how the sense of motion is enhanced on both sides of the frame, but the mid part is still relatively sharp, which makes the picture interesting in my opinion, and something that you can't really achieve with another type of lens. If you would like to improve your street photography skills, please do sign up for the Urban Street Narratives workshop, which I'm organizing together with my good photographer friends Robin Wong and Peter Fuscott. The workshop takes place in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia in the spring of 2026. It's gonna be 5 days of photography fun in a good company, and after the workshop you will be a better photographer. Please do check out the link down below and sign up. We would love to see you in Kuala Lumpur next year. I want to experiment a little bit here. I want to see how these pedestrians look if I use a relatively long 1/4 of a second shutter speed. There is nothing really sharp in this picture. It's a complete blur, but oddly enough, I really like the way it came out. Let's try the same here, but this time I'm gonna make sure my camera does not move. So only the people in the foreground will be blurry and everything else is gonna be sharp. Not too bad, but it would be better if there were more people walking across the frame. If you happen to live in a big city, give this technique a try. I think you can come up with something really awesome. Now let's try something different. I want to see how the reflection on the side of the tram would look if I use a long shutter speed. Now look at that, the reflection looks pretty amazing. Maybe a little bit tighter framing, maybe another camera angle, but anyway, this is definitely something I want to experiment with in the future, and I highly recommend you try this too. Here's another idea for you to try out. You can use the foreground to frame your subject in the background. In this case, I'm inside a building. I'm gonna try to frame a person inside one of those door frames. Maybe if I was standing here for a longer period of time, I could get a perfect picture like a person inside each of those door frames, but that is something for you to try out. Now here is a similar situation outside. I'm gonna use the shadows in the foreground and those columns to frame the people passing by in the background. Today I feel a little bit impatient. I don't want to stand here for too long, but if you happen to find a good spot, it might be worth it to stand there for a while and see if you can capture that masterpiece. I think I'm gonna use this narrow walkway as my next frame. Hey, not too bad. I love the strong perspective here, those converging lines, and backlight is always good light. Let's see if we can get another chance at this spot. This one is also quite nice. I love the shadow from the person, and the blue shirt matches the overall scene quite nicely too. Here I'm gonna use the shadows and the buildings to frame the people passing across the patch of light in the middle of the frame. Wow, I think this came out really nice. It's a really striking perspective and it works, at least in my opinion. Let's see if we can combine these shadows in the foreground and some motion blur here at the main railway station. And look at that, quite nice. I really like those blurry figures in the foreground and how they sort of align with those shadows from the window. With a super wide angle, you can use all kinds of quite surprising elements in the foreground to frame the scene in the background. In this case, I'm gonna use the lamppost and the traffic sign to frame the building and the scene in the background. And look at that, I even got a flying bird in the picture. Not too bad. Because of the ultra-wide angle of view, you can sometimes use a relatively tiny object in the foreground to frame a relatively big subject in the background. In this case, I'm gonna push my camera really close to this bench to take a picture of the church in the background. Unfortunately, the church itself is wrapped up, as you can see, because there is some sort of renovation work going on. Here I can create another awesome frame with these shadows and columns, but I definitely need a person or two in there to make the shot. And here they are, just as I ordered. Not a bad looking picture, might also work well in black and white because of those red and yellow squares in the background. They are a little bit distracting. Hey, how about these two ladies in identical outfits? Let me see if I can get a nice street photo of them. Alright, not exactly a masterpiece, but at least I gave it a try. Still not too bad. I like the shadows in the foreground, and those identical outfits are kinda nice. There are a lot of people passing by here, and I'm gonna try if I can create some sort of a chaotic scene that makes sense and fills the frame. Because with a super wide angle, sometimes you end up with a lot of empty space or a lot of unnecessary negative space in your frame. And I really want to avoid that here. I'm going to spray and pray here, even though I don't particularly like that technique. But in a scene like this, it makes sense because it is so challenging to see everything that is going on in the scene. So it makes sense to take a lot of frames and then pick the best one. Of all the pictures I captured here, I think this is the best one. It conveys the mood I was after. It is chaotic, I'm filling the frame, And I especially like the guy on the left who's trying to avoid being in my frame.
A super wide angle lens is a super versatile lens on which you can create many pictures that are impossible on another type of lens. In this video, I was using this brand new 16 to 30mm f2.8 Tamron lens, which in my opinion is a fantastic lens. And one of the big upsides with this lens is that it can take normal filters, unlike some other super wide angle zoom lenses. But of course, you don't need this Tamron for these kind of shots. Any ultra wide or super wide angle lens will do, of course. But it's a big upside if your ultra wide, super wide can take normal filters, because then those long exposure motion blur type of shots outdoors in bright daylight become so much more effortless and easier to execute. That's all I have for you in this video. Please do remember to check out the workshop link down below. I hope you found this informative, helpful, and maybe even entertaining. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you soon in the next one.